Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and today we're covering swimming mechanics. We're going to start by looking at energetics, which is basically the goal of trying to obtain efficient swimming. And then we're going to look at some of the adaptations and behaviors that marine mammals do in order to obtain efficient swimming. That includes anatomical adaptations that are going to reduce or minimize drag. We'll look at some diving patterns that we see to conserve energy. And then finally, we'll take a look at how dolphins swim at the surface to conserve energy. The field of bioenergetics basically poses this question: what cost is associated with a particular trait? So when we take a look at swimming, swimming tends to be very energetically expensive. And this is because water is 50 times more viscous than air. So therefore, it's a lot more difficult to move through the water than it is to move through air. Of course, you probably already know this. If you swim 100 meters, it's going to take a lot more energy than if you simply walk 100 meters. So what do the marine mammals need to do in order to reduce this energy cost? That's really what we're looking at today. We're going to start with some of the anatomical adaptations that reduce something called drag. Now, what is drag? I want you to imagine that you're going to go swimming. You could be wearing a fairly tight clothing like a swimming suit or even Speedos, and that is going to be clothing that reduces drag. Wetsuits also reduce drag because they create a more streamlined body. Contrast that to, for example, wearing a really big oversized t-shirt and then trying to swim. You know that the t-shirt, if you've ever worn one in the water, gets in the way. It makes it more difficult to move around because it contributes to drag. So whenever you look at this marine mammal body, they're going to want to try and do things to reduce drag or that feeling of swimming in a gigantic t-shirt. So what are some of the things that they have evolutionarily adapted to do in order to reduce this drag? Well, from an anatomical standpoint, there's actually three major ones. And the first one is to assume a hydrodynamic shape. And we see this pretty much regardless of the marine mammal taxa. So this is another example of convergent evolution. The hydrodynamic shape that is most efficient is called a fusiform shape. The fusiform shape basically looks almost like a tear, or something like a torpedo with a slender end to it. So that hydrodynamic shape we see allows the water to flow in what's called a laminar fashion, which means straight over the body without turbulence. And of course, we see in this image here, the dolphins, the blue whales, and even the sea lions have assumed that hydrodynamic shape. Some other anatomical adaptations that will reduce drag include minimizing external appendages. So this basically says if you don't need an appendage that's going to be sticking out of your fusiform shape, get rid of it. So what have we seen here? Well, for example, in marine mammals, the genitalia are all internal. You don't see penises or testes sticking out of marine mammals. They've moved internally because they're an appendage that would reduce drag, increase drag, and therefore you don't want that. So what are some of the other ones? Well, we see a reduction in ears. Ears, of course, are appendages, and for these cetaceans, they're completely missing their ears. You know, the ears have moved entirely internal, and even in the pinnipeds, we see a reduction. Now, we know that otariids still have ear flaps, but they're really small, so that they don't get in the way. And then finally, we see a reduction in limb size. So in the cetaceans, they've lost their hind limbs entirely because they don't have any use. So if you had them, they would just be getting in the way like that big t-shirt. And the only marine mammals that have actually kept their hind limbs are ones that either use them for propulsion, like the phocids, or use them for walking on land, like the otariids. And then finally, you might notice that the surface of these animals tends to be smooth. In the case of cetaceans, that means losing most of their hair. So they're not completely devoid of hair, but they've mostly lost their hair, and instead they have a smooth, rubbery surface that is probably best exemplified in the bottlenose dolphin picture here in the upper right, where you can see that smooth, silky appearance. But that's not to say that fur isn't smooth either. When you take a look at a marine mammal that's in the water, such as a pinniped or even a sea otter, and you look at their fur is basically straight, slicked back to create that smooth surface. And you can see that here as well in this picture of the California sea sea lion that has just come out of the water. Its fur coat is sleeked back and very shiny and smooth looking, and of course that is to reduce drag in the water. So what are some of the other things that we see associated with conserving energy? Well, one of the things that we see particularly with the deep divers, and of course these are going to be our phocids and our sperm whale, is that they tend to do behaviors that conserve the most amount of energy during descent or ascent in order, of course, to conserve oxygen. So when we take a look at pinnipeds, for example, deep diving pinnipeds, they tend to use buoyancy to their advantage. So if you are negatively buoyant, in other words, you're heavier than the water, then you can simply stop swimming, actively swimming, and just glide. Glide down like this, because your weight will pull you down. And of course, that's a lot more energetically efficient than trying to swim through the water. So we see that either during the descent or the ascent. And when we basically look at what type of buoyancy we're going to see, it really depends on the blubber layer. If you happen to have built up a really thick blubber layer, then it turns out that you're going to be positively buoyant, which means you're going to work to get down there, but then you're going to be able to float your way up and not work during the ascent. Conversely, if we are negatively buoyant, which usually means we have a thin blubber layer, we get to glide down, but then we have to work to get back up. So this picture on the screen here, if you take a look at it, actually shows a diving pattern of a southern elephant seal. And you might notice that you see kind of a gradual descent and then a quick ascent. That tells us that it's drifting down and then shooting back up, or it's working to get back up to the surface, but using its negative buoyancy to drift down. And of course, that's an oxygen saving mechanism. No single organism, however, exemplifies conserving energy during a dive better than the sperm whale. In a previous lecture, we talked about how the spermatocyte organ actually works as a buoyancy organ to help them achieve both positive and negative buoyancy. So what I want to do is actually come over here to this drawing that I've done of the spermatocyte organ and take a look at how that might work. So over here, you can see I've done kind of a simplified drawing of the spermatocyte organ. And the spermatocyte organ is this huge organ that basically includes the case and the junk. The case is going to include all of these waxy oils that change densities with different temperatures. When they cool down, the oils become very dense, and because this is such a large part of the entire sperm whale, the idea is that if you cool down the oils in the case, the sperm whale is going to have negative buoyancy and sink down towards the bottom. Conversely, if we warm up the oils in this case, then what we're going to do is we're going to decrease the density. We're going to make this sperm whale positively buoyant, and the sperm whale will then be able to ascend basically because it's lighter than the water and it just floats back up. So how is this regulated? Two different features. Although all sperm whales have a single blowhole, that blowhole basically leads to a cavity here that then splits into two directions. One that goes down into the lungs here, but another one that actually wraps around the case. And what happens is you can let a little bit of water in through that blowhole, and it will actually take water and kind of cool the oils in this case around here like so. In doing so, you cool down the entire case and you sink because you become negatively buoyant. So what happens when you want to ascend? Well, you simply direct your blood flow, and your blood, of course, being from a marine mammal, is going to be quite warm. You simply direct your blood flow and re-warm up those oils. They expand, and then you basically float to the surface. Evidence that this is exactly what happens includes the fact that sperm whales descend and ascend pretty much in the same spot. If you put a time depth recorder, we know that they can spend over an hour just hanging down there at the bottom of the ocean at 2,000 or 3,000 meters down, but it only takes them about 15 minutes to get down that depth and back up. That's pretty amazing. All right, so basically, again, the sperm whales are going to be ones that use their organ to achieve both positive and negative buoyancy, which is unique. And because of that, they are our most efficient divers. So finally, let's take a look at what happens when we swim at the surface. When you swim at the surface, for reasons I'm not going to discuss, it turns out that you actually generate a lot more drag at the surface than you do about 2 or 3 meters under the surface. So that's actually a significant amount of drag. It's about 5 times more at the surface than it is below the surface. So that's one of the reasons why swimming at the surface is actually inefficient. Unfortunately, marine mammals have to breathe, which means they have to come to the surface. And the smaller marine mammals, such as our porpoises and our small dolphins, spend lots of time at the surface. And so it's energetically inefficient to stay that close to the surface while they're breathing. But unfortunately, they have to swim at high speeds. So let's take a look at a dolphin energetics case study where we actually see some things that they do at the surface to try to conserve energy because swimming directly at the surface isn't very efficient. So a case study was done where they actually took 2 bottlenose dolphins, and what they did is they said, okay, we're going to force the dolphins to swim at different speeds and we're going to measure their energy consumption. At 2.1 meters per second, they basically established that as the baseline. And then what they did is they basically said, okay, we're going to force these dolphins to speed up a little bit faster. What happens here? So at 2.9 meters per second, what they found out was that the dolphins had to expend twice as much energy as they did at 2.1 meters per second, but they were still just swimming at the surface. So then they said, okay, go up to 3 meters per second, and suddenly the dolphins switched to this thing called wave riding, or riding the bow, that we'll look at in just a minute. And then they said, okay, speed up even faster, and then we'll get up to 5 meters per second. And then they switched to this thing called porpoising, where they actually jump out of the water. The idea behind porpoising is that, once again, the more time you spend in the air, the less energy you have to spend to move through it. So jumping out of the water is actually really efficient for them. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go to some footage of a whale watching expedition that we got to take a little while ago, and we got to see some of this wave riding actually happen as part of their energy conservation. So let's go ahead and take a look at that clip. Today we went out on a whale watching expedition out of San Diego Harbor. We went out of the harbor and into the coastline. While we were initially looking for some whales, preferably gray whales, we did get to see some other marine mammal life along the way. One of the most interesting things that we actually saw was a pod of common dolphins. We approached the pod of common dolphins and they were swimming perpendicular to the front of the boat. So they were swimming along the side here and we were coming up on them. And one of the most interesting things that they did is they actually turned around as an entire pod and got in front of the boat. And that's a very common behavior that we see. It's called riding the wave or riding the bow. And they spent maybe about 15-20 seconds riding the bow, basically directly in front of the boat. It was an awesome thing to see, and it's very common. One of the things that they do is they'll use the boat to basically push the water in front of them as a way to conserve energy. So we did see that. They stopped doing what they were doing. They turned around, they let the boat push the water in front of them, and it allows them to maintain really high swimming speeds without expending a lot of energy in order to keep moving at that speed. So as a pod, we saw that. They didn't stay around for too long, in part probably because we were not going the direction that they wanted to go as a group. But it was really great to see. Again, it was a pod of common dolphin, fairly common out here. Now that you know a little bit more about how dolphins move efficiently at the surface, I will see you next time for our next lecture.